All right. All right, so I'm going to address a question that may, by this point in the symposium, seem like a moot point, because you've certainly seen a lot of presentations on using cows as targeted grazing, as the targeted grazing species of choice. But nevertheless, you know, if you were to strike up a conversation maybe 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago in the hallway at one of these SRM meetings about targeted grazing, cattle would not have made the top of the list as the species of choice. Sheep and goats kind of got that honor five years ago, certainly 10 years ago. But that's changing, as you've seen from the presentations you've seen so far, and the presentations you'll continue to see for the rest of the afternoon. So why use cows? This is a little bit of a laundry list that was compiled by Karen Launchbaugh and Rachel Frost. I've added to it a little bit and tweaked it a little bit. But back when I was going to school, we had to taken classes from John Malachek and Fred Provenza and Phil Ernest. We had to read this paper by a fellow by the name of Hoffman, who categorized ruminant herbivores into 3 categories, those being roughage feeders or grass eaters, intermediate feeders, forb eaters, concentrate feeders or browsers. And Hoffman was trained as an animal scientist, and his rationale was the way animals are built influence what they eat. And John covered this to some extent in his presentation, but you know, cows, because of the way they're built, they're grass or forb eaters. They have these large, strong, flat muzzles that are good for harvesting grasses. They have large rumens for fermenting high fiber diets that are inherent in grass diets, and being high in lignin and cellulose, at least as they develop phenologically. From a management standpoint, they can also be used to trample vegetation, trample target vegetation, so mechanical control rather than a biocontrol agent per se. They're easier to contain than sheep or goats, goats being escape artists and most notably. They're more available, certainly, than sheep or goats, much to John Walker's chagrin. I think he would agree with that. And they're not as susceptible to predators. So this is a laundry list of why we would want to consider using cows in a targeted grazing project, and you can add to this list with your own reasons as to why you might want to or maybe not want to. So my tack is going to be a little bit different in that I'm going to cover some research that we didn't actually do. I'm going to leave that primarily to the graduate students that are going to follow me to talk about our research, but I want to talk about 3 studies that you may or may not be familiar with, and I've chosen these 3 studies, or projects I should say, because they address the full gamut of using cows for different life forms, including grasses, forbs, and shrubs. And then also they cover the full gamut of, or at least a variety of different reasons for using cows to accomplish different vegetation management objectives or to provide different ecosystem services. So I want to begin with this Germano et al. Published back in 2001, and this dealt with using cows to improve threatened and endangered species in the San Joaquin Valley of California. And this study was mostly concerned about these critters right here, all listed as either threatened or endangered: San Joaquin antelope squirrel, San Joaquin kangaroo rat, and the blunt-nosed lizard. And they were concerned about these species because they were threatened and endangered, but also because of this plant right here, red brome, cheatgrass's ugly cousin to the south. It's like red brome. It is a cool season annual grass, responds very favorably to cool season precipitation. And red brome was starting to encroach into these bare ground areas that was inherent in this ecological site. There's just a lot of bare ground in the San Joaquin Valley, and being the opportunistic plant ruderal species that red brome is, it was taking advantage of that. And when you got a lot of cool season precipitation, you got a situation that looked like this. And of course, you have a fire hazard in the same sense that you have fire hazards with cheatgrass later in the year. And then it was also impeding the ability of these species to find food for themselves and to keep themselves from becoming food, to hide from predators and so forth. So the idea then was to use cows early in the year when red brome was still palatable, green and palatable, and before it developed these nasty awns that can be seen here, makes it not very palatable at all. and make the landscape look more like this right after the cows had grazed it, and prevent it from going to a situation like this, reducing the red brome biomass. This is an aerial view of the study site. Each one of these large area, these blocks are 640 acres. So this is not a small plot study. This is large plot stuff. Everywhere you see a T is areas that were grazed by cattle. Everywhere you see a C embedded inside the 640 acre plot is a control area that was ungrazed. And if you look closely, you can see the sort of aerial fence line contrast where the area has been grazed appears lighter than the control plots here. So I want to show you, I'm not going to show you much in this presentation at all, but I do want to show you a little bit of data from this study so you get an idea what they accomplished. They weren't able to, this was a 10-year study, and they weren't able to use cows during every year of the study because red brome, like cheatgrass, responds to cool season precipitation. So, and not every year did they get enough precipitation that produced enough red brome, but in 2000, 2001 they did. So they used cows in 2000, 2001, got red brome on the y-axis. We've got the 4 640 acre plots that I showed you in the previous slide on the x-axis and the overall mean here. Red bars are the areas that were grazed by cattle. Blue bars are the areas that were ungrazed, those control plots embedded in the treatment plots. And you can see very quickly, you look across these 4 plots and the overall mean, that cattle grazing was successful in reducing red brome cover by about half in the grazed areas as compared to the ungrazed areas. 2001, they doubled their stocking rate. They didn't get as much, they were pretty successful reducing it by half, but they wanted to see if they could get even better effect in 2001. Doubled their stocking rate and got it down to about the 10% level as compared to just under 40% in the ungrazed plots. Now, they got less rain, cool season rain, in 2001, which is why you see less red brome cover in the ungrazed plots as well as the grazed plots. But the bottom line and the upshot that the researchers stated in their publication was that in some years, cattle grazing, heavy cattle grazing, can be the most effective tool to improve habitat for these threatened and endangered species that they were concerned about. Fire was not an option because it would have a potential negative impact on the threatened and endangered species themselves, and it would burn up the saltbush plants that the threatened and endangered species depended on for both food and cover. Okay, the next project that I want to talk about is not a study, but more a business, and this is Kathy Voss's business called Livestock for Landscapes. And since 2004, she's been training cows to eat weeds. When I say weeds, I'm talking about cool season dicots, many of them noxious weeds, knapweeds and thistles and so forth. So she's been using cows as a tool to control weeds, and I don't have, but I've captured a couple of websites from Kathy's business, called Livestock for Landscapes. And back in 2004, Kathy invented this method for training cows to eat weeds. So it's along the lines, I think, the question that Rachel got on leafy spurge a little bit. What I like about Kathy's work is it really combines the art and science of range management. The art comes from the trial and error that Kathy undoubtedly went through to develop these 4 steps that she talks about in her book and her DVD to train cows to eat weeds. And the science comes from employing some of Dr. Fred Provenza's principles, and Beth Burritt and Juan Villalba and others that have gone through Utah State University and learned how post-ingestive feedback is linked to the flavor of the food. And I won't take the time to go through those steps here today, don't have the time, but she's had pretty good success in getting cows to, and training them to behave a little bit like sheep and a little bit like goats. And the way Kathy puts it, it's a lot easier to train cows to eat weeds than it is to get a cattle rancher to switch to sheep and goats. They kind of look at you funny when you do that. But she's got studies all over the western United States, or projects, I should say, all over the western United States, Montana, California, Colorado, Oregon, that have used this technique pretty successfully. And I reviewed her book a couple of years ago, found it very interesting. She's got a DVD as well. And so I thought it would be worth mentioning that Kathy is using cows to become more educated and to eat weeds that we normally wouldn't associate. Okay, the last study I want to talk about is also from Utah State University, or comes out of Utah State University. This is Charles Peterson's work, published. He defended his thesis in January of last year and is in the process of developing a manuscript from the thesis. This study looks at sagebrush, monocultures of sagebrush, and of course, when you have a monoculture of sagebrush, that decreases the herbaceous layer, which in turn means less plant diversity, which translates to less animal diversity on the range. You have decreased nutrients across the landscape, increased lignin and terpenoids as a result of the monoculture of sagebrush that outcompetes the herbaceous layer for soil moisture, soil nutrients, sunlight, and so forth. Decreased rates of nutrient cycling and plant composition. So I think the purpose, Fred and Charles were kind enough to share these slides with me, but I think the purpose of this slide is to illustrate that when you have a lot of sagebrush, you run the risk of having an unwanted wildfire that burns too hot, and then you can transition from one state to even a less desirable state. What Charles did was to time grazing in the fall, primarily and into the winter a little bit. And the reason that he timed grazing in that fashion was terpenoids, which you heard John talk about terpenoids a little bit earlier in juniper. Well, terpenoids are a big secondary compound in sagebrush as well. In the fall, terpenoids are lower in the sagebrush. The herbaceous layer, that you're trying to get a chance to come back, is going dormant or senescing, so it's not as palatable. And with a little bit of energy and protein supplement, you can get the cows to start eating sagebrush because it tends to be more palatable when you get the cows on a higher nutritional plane by supplementing the cows with a little bit of energy and protein. It's also good for ranchers because the ranchers can cut back on the amount of hay that they have to feed in the wintertime. So again, here's the kind of the upshots from Charles's work. He divided cows into experienced and inexperienced animals. He had different ages of cows, ranging from calves to yearlings to adult cows. But the consistent trend was that the experienced cattle ate more sagebrush than the inexperienced animals and maintained their weight better. The experienced animals did. And then the effect on the vegetation was that the cattle browsing reduced the abundance of sagebrush and increased the abundance of grasses and forbs and increased biodiversity as well. So, and then lastly, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, using sagebrush as a forage resource can cut winter feed costs in half. Now, this is right after it's been browsed. Now, it looks pretty tough, and the herbaceous layer, of course, didn't come back right away. It took a couple of years. But the second and especially the third year of the study, the herbaceous layer came back 3 to 6 times higher in abundance than it was prior to the initiation of the study. I mentioned Justin Derner's, well, before I get to Justin's slide, I just summarize Charles's work by saying that their goals were to integrate livestock into the sagebrush ecosystem and create these locally adapted cattle that would eat more sagebrush, and in so doing, create mosaics of habitat within pastures and across landscapes to meet the different needs within and among species. And then shows this graphic from Fritz Knopf, published in 1996, that illustrates the historic effect of bison, how they roamed across the landscape. Some areas they had pretty excessive, heavy disturbance, some areas light disturbance, in some areas moderate disturbance, which was good for a variety of different avian species. And Knopf was concerned about avian species, but you could plug in just about any sort of game or non-game mammal species into this scenario as well. And I want to mention work because it's analogous to what Charles and Fred and Juan are doing up at Utah State University. Justin talks about an example of new direction of research into the Great Plains, so this traditional management paradigm shown here, over to the more of a conservation concern shown here. And we're all familiar with this graph, right? Range 101. This was on the ERMI test yesterday, by the way, some form of the graph, where you've got the animal daily gain per head, and then you've got gain per hectare over here, and we've been instructed to manage in this red box where those lines meet. Well, Justin is arguing for certainly creating moderate disturbance, but also paying attention to the underrepresented habitats that some species require, and then also paying attention to the light to little disturbance as well. And it goes back to the Aldo Leopold's, when in his book talking about the axe, the plow, the cow, the fire, the gun, and how you can manipulate habitat for a variety of different species. No one habitat is going to provide nirvana for all species. So really quickly, I know I'm out of time. Cattle are versatile, perhaps more versatile than we give them credit for. They can be used to target a variety of different plant life forms. I've talked about grasses, forbs, and shrubs here. And they can be used and have been used to provide a variety of ecosystem services, habitat improvement for wildlife, weed management, increased biodiversity, and fuel reduction. So, any questions or comments? Is Retta here? Oh, there she is.